It was a late September evening, and I sat in my home office pretending to work, though my mind was miles away. The house was quiet except for the faint sounds of Amelia packing in the bedroom. She said it was for a business trip to Seattle, but something about this trip didn't sit right with me. Over the past few months, the signs had become impossible to ignore: late nights, suspicious receipts, and then the burner phone I found in her gym bag. Tonight, the tension was unbearable. Through the crack in the door, I could see her folding clothes with the precision of someone rehearsing for a performance. She was packing more than business attire: swimsuits, lingerie, and casual outfits she hadn't worn in years. My stomach churned. This wasn't the Amelia I'd fallen in love with. The confident, sharp woman I'd married 8 years ago. Lately, her charm felt hollow, her warmth reserved for someone else. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she froze. Instead of picking it up, she flipped it face down and continued packing, though her hands moved faster now, less steady. I watched as she zipped her suitcase shut, a small, wistful smile crossing her lips. That smile wasn't meant for me. My jaw tightened, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Amelia glanced at the doorway again, her dark eyes flickering with unease. Was she nervous I might walk in? Or was the guilt finally catching up to her? I thought about confronting her right then, about the photo I'd saved from her social media weeks ago. The one of her at a rooftop bar, smiling too brightly beside a man I didn't know. But I held back. This confrontation had to be on my terms, not hers. I stood and walked to the bedroom, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't notice me at first, too preoccupied with rearranging her suitcase. The floor creaked beneath my weight, and she flinched, spinning around. For a moment, her face betrayed panic before she forced a smile. "Victor," she said, her voice too bright, too rehearsed. "You startled me." I crossed my arms, studying her. "Packing for your trip?" I asked casually, though my tone was sharper than I intended. "Yes," she replied quickly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Just finishing up. Long week ahead. You know how it is." Her laugh was strained, her eyes darting toward the suitcase as if it might betray her. "Amelia," I said evenly, stepping closer. Her forced composure cracked, and she stiffened, her smile fading. "We need to talk." Amelia's forced smile faltered as she turned back to her suitcase, fiddling with the edges of the folded clothes. She wasn't fooling me. Every movement seemed calculated, a deliberate effort to avoid looking directly at me. The tension between us hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I stood silently for a moment, watching her. This was a woman who thrived on control, someone who always had the perfect explanation ready. But tonight, her composure was fraying at the edges. She seemed too preoccupied, her hands moving faster than usual as she straightened items on the dresser that didn't need adjusting. Her suitcase lay open on the bed, revealing its damning contents: swimsuits, lingerie, and casual dresses. None of it looked like it belonged on a business trip. I gestured toward it, wordlessly calling attention to the discrepancy. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the zipper before forcing herself to continue packing. She finally turned to face me, a neutral expression plastered across her face. Her practiced calm would have been convincing to anyone else, but I knew her too well. I had seen this look before, back when she was trying to explain a small financial oversight or cover for being late. Only this time, it was bigger, much bigger. The room felt colder as the silence stretched. My gaze didn't waver, and I could see her bracing herself. She gave me a half-hearted explanation about needing downtime after a long conference. It was almost laughable how easily the lie slipped from her lips. Her voice was steady, but her body betrayed her. The tense shoulders, the slight tremble in her hands as she gestured toward the suitcase. I didn't react, refusing to let her words derail me. Instead, I brought up everything I had noticed over the past few months: the late nights, the unrecognizable charges on our credit card, and the burner phone I had found in her gym bag. Each word was deliberate, each detail aimed at piercing through the wall she was trying to build. Her reaction was defensive, of course. She deflected, trying to redirect the blame toward me. She even accused me of invading her privacy. That sharp edge in her voice, meant to disarm me, only confirmed what I already suspected. There was no guilt about what she'd done, only about getting caught. I didn't rise to the bait. I had seen this tactic too many times in my career as an attorney. When people are cornered, they lash out to distract from their own actions. Her words blurred into the background as I kept my focus. The truth wasn't in what she was saying, but in how desperately she was trying to avoid answering the unspoken question. Her phone buzzed again on the nightstand. She stiffened but didn't look at it, an act so deliberate it might as well have been a confession. I couldn't stop the wave of anger that surged through me. Weeks of suspicion and gut-wrenching doubt boiled to the surface. I didn't need her to admit anything. Her silence and evasions told me everything I needed to know. The air in the room felt heavier as I stepped back. My voice was quieter now, the edge replaced by a grim sense of certainty. I laid out everything I had been questioning, letting her feel the weight of it. Her guilt flickered across her face for just an instant, quickly masked by defiance. She wasn't going to give me the satisfaction of an admission. Without another word, I turned and left the room. The sound of the zipper closing her suitcase followed me down the hall, a final, unspoken acknowledgement of everything she refused to say. I left the bedroom, but the tension followed me like a shadow. In the stillness of the house, every sound seemed louder. The hum of the air conditioner, the creak of the stairs under my weight. My mind raced, replaying every moment of the evening, from the flicker of guilt on Amelia's face to the way she ignored her buzzing phone. Each detail felt like another nail in the coffin of the life we'd built together. In the kitchen, I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. The polished granite was cool beneath my fingers, grounding me for a moment. I thought back to when the doubts first began, months of small, troubling signs I had brushed aside. The late nights at work, the Pilates classes that stretched longer than they should, the mysterious lunches that turned into dinners. Each time, she had an excuse ready, smooth and confident. But then I found the burner phone in her gym bag. That was the moment I knew the excuses weren't adding up. Tonight, with her suitcase full of outfits that had nothing to do with business, there was no doubt left. Her phone buzzed again upstairs. It had been going off every few minutes. A relentless reminder that she wasn't alone in this deception. Whoever was messaging her knew she was still home. Were they confirming plans? Asking why she hadn't responded? My stomach churned at the thought of her sharing secrets with someone else, laughing with him, planning a future that didn't include me. I climbed the stairs quietly, my anger bubbling beneath the surface. Her door was ajar, and I could see her silhouette against the soft glow of the bedside lamp. She was holding her phone now, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Her posture was tense, her movements hurried, as if the weight of the night was pressing down on her too. I stayed in the shadows, watching as she glanced toward the door, her body stiffening when she thought she heard something. But I didn't step inside. Instead, I turned and retreated to my office, my chest tight with frustration and disbelief. Sitting at my desk, I opened the file I had started weeks ago, a folder labeled Amelia. Inside were screenshots, receipts, and every small clue that had led me to this moment. I added more notes now. The lingerie in her suitcase, her defensive demeanor, and the way she ignored the buzzing phone until she was alone. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, painting a picture of betrayal I could no longer ignore. The house was quiet again. Upstairs, I could hear the faint rustle of her movements as she finished packing. She thought she was being careful, that her lies were seamless. But I was already planning my next move. Tomorrow wasn't just the day she planned to leave. It was the day I would act. The house was eerily quiet the next morning, a silence broken only by the soft hum of the coffee maker as I stood in the kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but it didn't soothe me. My mind was preoccupied, turning over the events of the previous night. Amelia had been careful, almost too careful, as though her lies were a fragile vase she was balancing on a tightrope. Yet, the weight of her deception was unmistakable. I heard her footsteps upstairs, moving quickly but deliberately, a sign of her usual precision. The soft thud of her suitcase being pulled across the bedroom floor made my jaw tighten. She was preparing to leave, probably feeling triumphant that she had avoided suspicion. The thought made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to stay composed. Confrontation wasn't the plan. Not yet. She came downstairs dressed in her usual professional attire, but the details didn't match. Her fitted blazer, stylish as ever, contrasted sharply with the casual dresses and swimsuits I'd seen her pack. She had perfected this facade, but now I saw through it. Her hair was neatly styled, her makeup subtle but flawless, and her expression carried an air of detachment, almost like a mask. "Good morning," she said brightly, her voice too chipper for the early hour. She glanced at me briefly before turning to pour herself a cup of coffee. "Busy day ahead?" "Always," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I leaned against the counter, watching her as she moved around the kitchen. She avoided my gaze, her attention fixed on stirring sugar into her cup. She had always been good at this, redirecting the energy in the room, keeping control of the narrative. It was one of the things I admired about her once. Now it felt like manipulation. I noticed the faint vibration of her phone on the counter. Her eyes flickered toward it, her body tensing for just a second before she ignored it. She was being careful not to draw attention, but the moment wasn't lost on me. That phone was her lifeline to him. My jaw tightened, but I said nothing. She finally turned toward me, sipping her coffee like it was any other morning. "My car service will be here soon," she said casually, setting the mug down. "Traffic to the airport is always a nightmare this time of day." I nodded, masking my emotions with practiced ease. "Have everything you need?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, something only someone who knew her well would notice. "Of course," she said, her voice steady but not quite natural. "It's just a quick trip, you know. A quick trip." The words hung in the air, heavier than she realized. I wondered if she felt any guilt at all, if there was even a flicker of doubt in her mind about the lies she was telling. But her composure remained intact, the same way it had for months. She had perfected this routine. Her car service arrived right on time, the low rumble of tires audible through the kitchen window. She grabbed her suitcase, her movements efficient and purposeful, and wheeled it toward the front door. I followed her, staying a step behind, my mind racing with everything I knew and everything I still needed to confirm. At the door, she turned to me, her smile polite but distant. "I'll call you tonight when I get in," she said, the lies slipping so easily from her lips that it made my chest tighten. "Safe travels," I replied, keeping my expression neutral. My tone was steady, but inside the anger simmered. I didn't trust myself to say more. As the car pulled away from the driveway, I stood at the window, watching her go. The facade she wore so effortlessly, the careful choreography of her movements, all of it left me cold. She thought she was in control, that her plans were seamless. But she didn't know I was already one step ahead. The quiet of the house felt oppressive as I returned to my office. Sitting down at my desk, I opened the folder on my laptop, the file that had grown with every small clue and inconsistency I'd uncovered. This morning had given me more to add. Her forced cheerfulness, the tension in her body, the phone she pretended not to notice. I stared at the screen for a long moment, the pieces of her betrayal falling into place. Amelia might have left the house, but her lies were still here, lingering like a stain I couldn't scrub away. And soon, she would learn that I wasn't as blind as she thought. The house felt emptier without Amelia, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was oppressive, the kind of quiet that forces your thoughts to run wild. I sat at my desk, staring at the growing file of evidence I'd been compiling, the cursor blinking at the edge of a freshly typed note. Morning departure, overly cheerful, tension when phone buzzed. Each detail was another piece of the puzzle, but the edges of the picture were still blurry. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. She thought she had left without suspicion, but her every move had confirmed what I already knew. The question now wasn't if she was lying. It was how far her betrayal went. I needed answers, and I needed them now. Pulling out my phone, I opened the tracking app one had installed on her burner phone weeks ago. It wasn't something I ever imagined myself doing, spying on my wife, but desperation pushes you into places you don't want to go. The app loaded slowly, the spinning wheel taunting me, until finally a location popped up. Not the airport, as she claimed, but a small cafe on the other side of town. My jaw tightened. She hadn't even tried to make it believable. Her car service hadn't taken her to catch a flight. It had taken her to him. I stared at the map for a long moment, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. The cafe wasn't far. I could be there in 15 minutes, maybe less if I didn't care about the speed limit. But what then? Confronting her in public would only give her the upper hand, a chance to play the victim or twist the narrative. Instead, I opened another browser tab and began searching for private investigators. My own instincts had gotten me this far, but I needed someone who could dig deeper, someone who could gather evidence I couldn't. Within minutes, I found a local agency with good reviews, specializing in cases like mine. A quick phone call later, I had an appointment set for the afternoon. Time crawled as I waited for the meeting, my mind racing with possibilities. Who was she meeting at that cafe? Was it the man from the rooftop photo, or someone else entirely? How long had this been going on? And how many layers of lies had she woven to keep me in the dark? Each question cut deeper than the last, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me like a heavy stone. At the appointed time, I arrived at the investigator's office, a nondescript building tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. Inside, I met Jennifer, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who exuded competence. She listened quietly as I explained my suspicions, her pen scratching notes onto a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "This isn't the first case like this I've handled," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "People think they're clever, but they always leave a trail. If she's cheating, we'll find out." Her confidence was both reassuring and unnerving. I handed over everything I had: photos, screenshots, the tracking app's data. She nodded as she looked it over, her pen moving quickly as she jotted down more notes. "Give me a few days," she said. "I'll keep you updated." As I left the office, a mix of emotions churned inside me. Relief that someone else was now involved, anxiety about what she might uncover, and anger at Amelia, at myself, at the situation I never thought I'd find myself in. Back at home, I sank into the chair in my office, the silence wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. My laptop screen glowed faintly, the folder labeled Amelia staring back at me. It was a strange thing to sit in your own home, surrounded by memories of someone you thought you knew, and realize it was all built on a lie. The hours passed slowly, each minute dragging as I waited for an update from Jennifer. The house felt too big, too empty, and the weight of what was happening pressed down on me. This was no longer just suspicion. It was a countdown to confirmation, and I wasn't sure what would hurt more: the lies I already knew about, or the ones I hadn't yet uncovered. The first day without Amelia stretched longer than I could have imagined. Every corner of the house reminded me of her, but not in the way it once had. Now, each memory felt tainted, every shared laugh or stolen moment of intimacy overshadowed by the growing weight of betrayal. I spent the morning pacing, my mind alternating between anger and anticipation. What would Jennifer find? What more could there be to uncover? I checked the tracking app on my phone. Amelia's location hadn't changed. She was still at the cafe. Nearly 2 hours had passed since I first noticed she wasn't at the airport. Was she just sitting there, or was this some kind of rendezvous? My thoughts spiraled as I imagined her laughing with him, sharing things that should have been mine alone. Unable to sit still, I decided to focus my energy elsewhere. I returned to the folder I'd compiled, meticulously going through every piece of evidence I had gathered. Each receipt, each screenshot, each note carried its own sting. I paused on the rooftop photo, zooming in on the man's face. He looked average, unremarkable, even. What was it about him that had made her risk everything? The sound of my phone buzzing snapped me back to the present. It was a text from Jennifer. "We're monitoring her now. I'll update you as soon as we have more." The message brought some relief, but it didn't quiet the unease gnawing at me. Knowing she was being watched felt like a step forward, but it wasn't enough. I needed the full story, and I needed to hear it from her, no matter how much it hurt. As the day wore on, the house grew more oppressive. I found myself wandering aimlessly, my thoughts a storm of questions. Had I missed the signs earlier? Or had she become this good at hiding things? The latter seemed more likely. Amelia had always been meticulous, a woman who thrived on control. If she was lying, she was doing it with precision. By evening, I decided to step outside. The air was crisp, the first hints of autumn creeping in. I walked down our quiet street, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot grounding me for a moment. But even out here, I couldn't escape the weight of what was happening. Every happy couple I passed, every warmly lit window, felt like an accusation. How had I let things come to this? Back at the house, I checked my phone again, hoping for an update. There was nothing new. I slumped into the armchair in the living room, staring at the photos on the mantel. One of them, a candid shot from a vacation years ago, caught my attention. In it, Amelia was laughing, her eyes bright, and her hand resting on my arm. Looking at it now, I couldn't tell if the warmth I saw was real or just another performance. My thoughts drifted to the moment I'd first suspected something was wrong. It wasn't the burner phone or the receipts. It was her smile, different somehow, as if it belonged to someone else. That smile haunted me now, the memory of it twisting in my chest like a knife. The hours dragged on until my phone buzzed again. Another message from Jennifer. Activity. "We'll call you soon." My pulse quickened. I stared at the screen, feeling equal parts relief and dread. The truth was coming, and with it, the end of whatever illusion I'd been holding on to. I braced myself for what was next. The morning came with a restless energy I couldn't shake. I had barely slept the night before, my thoughts consumed by what I now knew. The name Julian Carter repeated in my mind like a broken record. each repetition adding to the knot of anger in my chest. Amelia's deceit wasn't just casual. It was deliberate, the kind of betrayal that required precision and intent. She'd carefully crafted her lies, and for weeks, months even, I had unwittingly played along. I sat in the kitchen with my coffee, staring at the phone on the table. Jennifer's last update had been clear. Amelia and Julian were meeting today, following the same routine as before. It was predictable, almost mechanical, as though they had rehearsed every step to avoid detection. But this time, I wasn't in the dark. This time, I was ready. Jennifer's team had surveillance in place, and she promised I'd have concrete proof by the end of the day. That was the plan, and yet I couldn't shake the urge to act. Sitting in the house, waiting for updates felt unbearable. The walls seemed to close in around me, suffocating in their silence. By late morning, the first text from Jennifer arrived. She's at the cafe. Same location as before. Carter is there too. I could picture it vividly. Amelia sitting across from him, her practice smile in place, leaning in close like she used to with me. The thought made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the moment to act on impulse. Not yet. Another message came an hour later. They've left the cafe, driving toward the same hotel as last time. We'll keep following. I stared at the screen, my anger bubbling beneath the surface. I imagined her slipping into Julian's car, her laugh carrying the same warmth that used to be reserved for me. The hotel wasn't just a meeting place. It was a destination, a deliberate choice to separate herself from the life we'd built together. My hands tightened in a fist as I tried to focus on the bigger picture. The evidence Jennifer was collecting wasn't just for me. It was a foundation for the inevitable confrontation. But waiting felt like torture, each minute dragging longer than the last. Unable to sit still any longer, I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly through town. The familiar streets blurred as my mind churned with thoughts of the past and the present. I thought about our first years together, when Amelia's smile had been genuine, her affection unfiltered. Back then, the idea of betrayal seemed impossible. She wasn't just my wife. She was my partner, my anchor. But now, that foundation had been shattered, replaced with lies and stolen moments. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Jennifer's voice was calm when I answered, her professionalism unwavering. "We have everything we need," she said. "Photos, video footage, timestamps, it's all there. If you want to move forward, this will hold up in any confrontation or legal proceeding." Her words were both a relief and a dagger. The clarity I had wanted for so long was now in my hands, but it came at a price. There was no more room for doubt. Amelia had chosen this path, and I couldn't turn back now. Jennifer continued, explaining the next steps. "They're still at the hotel, but they'll likely leave soon. My team can keep following if you want to monitor her return home." I hesitated, the weight of the decision settling over me. Did I want to see more? Or was this enough? My heart told me to act, to confront her as soon as she walked through the door, but my mind urged caution. There was still more to consider. How to approach her, what to say, how to ensure I didn't give her an escape route. "That won't be necessary," I finally said. "I have what I need." After hanging up, I drove back home, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The rage I'd felt earlier had dulled into something colder, sharper. This wasn't just about Amelia anymore. It was about me, about reclaiming control, about deciding how this story would end. The house was dark when I returned, the quietness amplifying my thoughts. I sat in the office for hours, reviewing the evidence Jennifer had sent. Each photo, each timestamp, was another layer of truth I could no longer deny. Amelia and Julian, smiling, touching, laughing, it was all there in vivid detail. When the clock struck midnight, I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Tomorrow, Amelia would come home, walking through the door as though nothing had changed. But this time, she wouldn't be in control. This time, the lies would end. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds outside the window. The calmness of the world felt like a cruel joke, mocking the storm brewing inside me. I sat up slowly, staring at the faint sunlight streaming through the curtains. Today was the day. Amelia would come home, and everything would finally be laid bare. In the kitchen, I made coffee, the routine grounding me in a way little else could. The house was still and quiet, giving me time to think. The evidence Jennifer had gathered sat on my laptop, waiting for me to decide how to use it. I had gone through every photo, every timestamp video. Each one felt like another knife twisting in my chest. Amelia's laughter, her intimate touches, the way she looked at Julian. It was all there, undeniable and devastating. I checked the clock. It was still early, but I knew she'd be back later in the afternoon. She'd want to return before evening, to maintain the illusion that she'd been at a work conference. I could almost hear her voice now, rehearsing some generic story about meetings and client dinners. The thought made my jaw tighten. The hours passed slowly, every tick of the clock a reminder of what was to come. I busied myself with small tasks, tidying the living room, organizing files in my office, but none of it held my focus. My mind was fixed on the confrontation ahead. How would she react? Would she deny it? Or would she try to twist the narrative? Amelia was good at manipulation, but this time, the evidence was irrefutable. Around noon, I stepped outside for a walk. The fresh air was a welcome change, though it did little to settle my nerves. The neighborhood was quiet, most people out at work or running errands. As I passed the park at the end of the street, I thought about the life Amelia and I had built together. The picnics, the lazy Sunday afternoons, the plans for the future we made in this very neighborhood. It all felt so distant now, like someone else's memories. By the time I returned home, the sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway. I checked my phone. A message from Jennifer confirmed Amelia had left the hotel earlier that morning and was on her way back into town. Her tracking team had stopped following her, per my request. I didn't need to know every detail anymore. I had everything I needed. I spent the next hour preparing myself mentally. Confrontations weren't new to me. I'd spent years as a lawyer, tearing through lies in courtrooms and getting to the truth. But this was different. This wasn't a client or a stranger. This was my wife, the woman I had shared my life with, the person I thought I knew better than anyone. As the clock ticked closer to her expected return, I moved to the living room and sat on the couch, the laptop resting on the coffee table in front of me. The screen was dark, but I knew what waited inside, the evidence that would end this chapter of my life. I stared at the blank screen, my reflection staring back at me, steeling myself for what was to come. Finally, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood, every muscle in my body tense. The front door opened moments later, and Amelia stepped inside, suitcase in hand. She looked as polished as ever, her blazer pristine, her hair perfectly styled. She smiled when she saw me, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey," she said lightly, setting her suitcase by the door. "You're home early?" I nodded, my gaze locked on her. "Amelia," I said evenly, my voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." She hesitated, her smile faltering for just a moment before she quickly recovered. "Of course," she said, her tone casual as she slipped off her shoes. "Let me just put my things away." "Now," I interrupted, my voice sharper this time. She froze, her eyes meeting mine. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her expression. Slowly, she moved toward the couch, her movements careful, deliberate. She sat across from me, her posture stiff, and for the first time, there was no trace of the confidence she usually carried. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. I reached for the laptop, opening it and turning the screen toward her. The first photo filled the screen. Her and Julian at the cafe, his hand resting on her back, her smile bright and familiar, too familiar. Her breath hitched, and she leaned back slightly, her expression shifting from surprise to something else. "Guilt." "Start talking," I said, my tone cold and unyielding. The silence between us was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. Amelia stared at the laptop screen, her expression frozen between shock and guilt. I sat across from her, my hands folded, waiting. I wouldn't fill the silence for her. She had to speak first. Finally, her lips parted. "Victor, I can explain." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and the words felt like a slap. Predictable. I almost laughed at the absurdity of her trying to explain away something so blatant. "Go ahead," I said, my tone sharp, though my composure didn't waver. She hesitated, her polished exterior cracking under the weight of the evidence. Her hands trembled as she scrolled to the next photo. Her and Julian leaving the cafe, his arm draped casually around her. She lingered on the image, searching for an excuse. "It's not what it looks like," she said finally, her voice trembling. "He's just a friend, someone I talk to about work. I've been stressed and—" "Don't insult me," I cut in, my patience thinning. "I'm not clueless. I know exactly what this is." I tapped the laptop, pulling up a damning video Jennifer had sent. Amelia and Julian entering a hotel together, laughing, before disappearing inside. Her face paled. She faltered, then tried again, softer this time. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I was lonely. We've been so distant, and I needed something else. Her words stung, not because I believed her excuses, but because of their hollowness. She wasn't apologizing. She was justifying, shifting the blame to me. You needed something else, I said coldly. So instead of talking to me, your husband, you lied. You built an entire life behind my back. Was it worth it, Amelia? Was he worth it? Her gaze fell to the floor, tears forming in her eyes. She muttered something about not wanting to hurt me, but I had heard enough. Congratulations, I snapped. You failed. I stood, grabbing the laptop and snapping it shut. My voice was final as I said, this isn't something we can come back from. I'm done. Panic flashed across her face. Victor, wait, we can fix this. I'll stop seeing him. No. I cut her off. You don't get to make promises now. You ended this the moment you decided he was worth more than the truth. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her in stunned silence. My heart was heavy, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of relief. The lies were over, and now I could start rebuilding what she had destroyed. I shut the office door behind me, the sound echoing in the stillness of the house. My chest felt tight as I replayed the confrontation with Amelia. Her excuses, her justifications, and her attempts to shift blame had been hollow, as though spoken by a stranger. The life we'd built together now felt like a lie, leaving me hollow in its wake. Through the door, I heard faint movements in the living room. I imagined her sitting there, perhaps rehearsing a new excuse or crafting another apology. But I didn't care. Whatever she had to say was meaningless now. Her words couldn't undo the betrayal, nor could they repair the damage she'd caused. I turned back to my desk, where the folder of evidence lay open. I began organizing it methodically, screenshots of texts, photos, and time-stamped videos of her and Julian. It was surreal, reducing years of marriage to a collection of proof, but it wasn't just personal anymore. It was legal. The next step was clear: finalize the divorce. A knock came at the office door, soft and hesitant. Victor, Amelia's voice called, trembling. Please, can we talk? I stayed silent, gripping the edge of the desk. After everything, she wanted to talk now? After months of lies and betrayal? I'm sorry, she continued, her voice breaking. I know I messed up. Please, let me explain. I walked to the door, but didn't open it. My voice, cold and steady, carried through the barrier. There's nothing left to explain. I've seen enough. The silence stretched before she spoke again, desperation creeping into her tone. You can't just shut me out like this. I made a mistake, but we can fix it. Don't throw everything away. Her words stung, but not because they moved me. They were a stark reminder of her twisted reality. I wasn't the one who threw everything away. That had been her decision, long before I discovered the truth. You threw it away, I said sharply. This isn't something we can fix. It's over. Her footsteps retreated, slow and heavy. Moments later, I heard the front door close softly behind her. She was gone for now. Maybe to Julian, maybe somewhere else. It didn't matter. Her choices had severed the last threads of my concern. The rest of the day passed in a haze of meaningless tasks. I sent the evidence to my lawyer with a short note to schedule the next available appointment. I made a list of what needed to be addressed: bank accounts, the house, shared assets. The focus on logistics helped keep the emotional weight at bay. By evening, the house felt impossibly empty. The quiet pressed down on me, amplifying the reality of my situation. Every photo on the wall, every piece of furniture felt like a relic of a life that no longer existed. Pouring a drink, I stared at the amber liquid catching the dim light as I swirled it in the glass. This wasn't the end I had envisioned for us, but it was the one Amelia had chosen. Tomorrow, I'd take the first steps toward rebuilding my life. Tonight, I let the silence settle, knowing it marked the start of something new, something without her. The morning after Amelia left, the air in the house felt heavier, like it was bracing for the fallout. I hadn't slept much, and waking early didn't bring relief. The confrontation had been decisive, but there was still so much to unravel. I started the day in the office. The evidence of her betrayal spread out before me. The photos, screenshots, and notes weren't just proof. They were grounding. Each piece reminded me that this wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and there was no going back. Mid-morning, my lawyer called. His calm, professional tone was a contrast to the emotional storm brewing inside me. I outlined everything: the timeline, the evidence, and my goal: a swift and clean divorce. No games, no theatrics, just closure. With what you've provided, this will be straightforward, he said. Her infidelity is clear. Depending on her cooperation, we could resolve this quickly. Are you ready to proceed? Yes, I said, the word feeling heavier than I expected. Saying it aloud made it final. I want this behind me. We discussed logistics, how the paperwork would be filed, the likely division of assets, and what to expect if she contested anything. Part of me wondered how she'd react when she received the papers. Would she fight? Accept the consequences? It didn't matter. I was ready for either. By early afternoon, I heard her car pull into the driveway. The soft click of the front door followed, her hesitant footsteps echoing in the quiet house. I stayed in the office, waiting for her to come to me. This was her mess. I wouldn't make it easier for her. Victor, her voice called tentative. I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch. Eventually, she appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with the redness of tears. Before she could speak, I raised a hand, cutting her off. You're here to pick up anything you need, I said, my tone calm but distant. Or for another apologies? Her lips pressed into a thin line. Victor, please. I know you're angry. I'm not angry, I interrupted, surprised at the truth of my words. The rage I carried had cooled, replaced by something sharper. Resolve? I'm done. That's not the same as anger. Her composure cracked. I made a mistake, she said, her voice trembling. But that doesn't mean we have to throw everything away. Stop. My voice was sharp as I stood, closing the distance between us. Don't insult me by calling this a mistake. It was a choice, a series of them, and you made them knowing exactly what you were risking. Her tears spilled over, but I felt nothing. Whatever connection we once had, whatever sympathy I might have offered was gone. She had burned it away with every lie and every moment she chose him over me. I've spoken to my lawyer, I said, my tone steady. You'll be receiving the paperwork soon. This will be handled legally and efficiently. The rest, your guilt, your excuses, I don't want it. Her face crumpled, and she nodded weakly. Okay, she whispered. Without another word, she turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind her. It felt final, like the end of a book I had no desire to reopen. For the first time in weeks, I breathed deeply. The ties had been severed. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was clear. This was my life now, and I was ready to reclaim it. The house felt impossibly still after Amelia left. I stood in the office for a long moment, letting the silence settle over me. The door she had closed might as well have been the door to the past, shutting off the life we once shared. It felt final, and though there was pain, there was also relief. The endless cycle of lies and suspicion had ended. I turned back to the desk, where the folder of evidence lay open. It wasn't just proof of her betrayal anymore. It was the foundation for reclaiming my life. With the legal process set in motion, I spent the rest of the day sorting through logistics. Shared accounts, property details, financial documents. The tasks felt clinical, devoid of emotion. That made them easier to face. By late afternoon, I needed to escape the house. The walls seemed haunted by memories I didn't want to revisit. I grabbed my keys and went for a drive, letting the open road clear my head. Familiar streets felt strange now, as though the world had shifted just slightly. I stopped at a park on the edge of town, a place Amelia and I had once walked together. Sitting on a bench overlooking the water, I allowed myself to reflect, not on what I'd lost, but on what I still had. It hit me then. I had spent so much time focused on Amelia, on us, that I had let myself fade into the background. The betrayal hurt, yes, but what stung more was realizing how much of myself I'd given away. That was over now. I wasn't just closing the chapter on her. I was reclaiming control of my own story. When I returned home, the quiet felt different. It wasn't oppressive anymore. It was peaceful, like a blank slate waiting for something new. I sat down in the office and started drafting a list of what I wanted for myself. Small goals at first: take a trip, reconnect with old friends, focus on my health. They were simple, but they felt like steps toward rebuilding. The next morning, my lawyer called with an update. The papers would be served to Amelia by the end of the week. The process was moving quickly, and I welcomed it. The sooner it was over, the sooner I could fully close this chapter. Amelia's betrayal had left scars, but I refused to let them define me. As I sat in the quiet of my office, the weight of the past began to lift. The life I had with her was gone, but my life wasn't over. It was mine to rebuild, and I was ready. The days after Amelia's departure passed in surreal stillness. The house, once alive with shared routines, felt cavernous. At first, the emptiness gnawed at me, each silence a reminder of what was gone. But as the week went on, the quiet began to feel less like a void and more like a canvas, a blank space waiting to be reclaimed. By midweek, my lawyer confirmed the divorce papers had been served. I knew because Amelia called. Her number flashed on my phone, and for a moment, I hesitated. But I wanted to hear her reaction, to see if she could muster any accountability. "Victor," she said, her tone shifting between anger and desperation. "You really went through with it?" I let her words linger before replying. "What did you expect? That I'd wait while you decided if you wanted me or him?" Her sharp inhale betrayed her shock. "It's not like that. It's exactly like that." I cut in, my patience worn thin. "You made your choices, Amelia. Now you live with them." Her voice softened. "We can fix this. I'll end things with Julian, I promise." A bitter laugh escaped me. "You think it's that simple? That a promise undoes months, maybe years, of lies? I'm done. This is over." Silence stretched between us until she finally whispered, "I'm sorry," and hung up. I stared at the phone, the weight of her apology settling over me. If she thought words could erase what she'd done, she had never truly understood me or us. After that, I heard nothing more from her. My lawyer handled the process as I focused on moving forward. Cleaning the house became oddly cathartic, sorting through years of accumulated belongings. Some photos and keepsakes I kept, others I boxed for donation or the attic. They belonged to a life I no longer recognized. One evening, I found a honeymoon photo of us at sunset, arms wrapped around each other. I stared at it before placing it face down in a box. That version of us no longer existed. Maybe it never had. Outside the house, life began trickling back in. I met an old friend for dinner, something I hadn't done in years. We avoided talking about Amelia, and for the first time in weeks, I laughed, a genuine, unforced laugh. It felt foreign but good. Slowly, I began reclaiming parts of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. Long morning runs cleared my mind. I started planning a solo trip, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The house, once filled with memories of Amelia, was becoming mine again. Rearranged furniture, fresh paint, and small changes turned it into a reflection of who I was now, not who we had been. Each step forward felt lighter. The divorce wasn't finalized yet, but in many ways, I already felt free. For the first time in years, I was living for myself, not for her or the illusion of us. For me, the day the divorce was finalized, I sat in my office, staring at the email from my lawyer. It was official. Amelia and I were no longer tied together. The weight I'd carried for weeks didn't vanish immediately, but there was a quiet sense of closure. A line had been drawn between the past and the future. I looked around the office, a space that had been both my refuge and a battleground. The folder of evidence was gone, handed over during the legal process, and with it went the constant reminders of betrayal. The room felt lighter, as if it had been waiting for this moment to exhale. The days that followed were an odd mix of relief and sadness. I wasn't naive enough to pretend everything had been bad between us. There had been real moments of happiness, but those memories no longer held the power they once did. They were fragments of a puzzle I no longer needed to solve. I turned my focus toward the solo trip I'd been planning. A few weeks along the coast, simple and free of expectations. Packing lightly, I left behind the house, still echoing with Amelia's absence, and set off with no clear itinerary. The open road, salty breezes, and endless horizons were exactly what I needed. It wasn't an escape, it was rediscovery. Somewhere along the way, I realized how much of myself I'd sacrificed in the name of compromise, of us. I'd given so much to the idea of our life together that I'd forgotten what I wanted for my own. With no one else to consider, I felt free to figure that out. When I returned home, the house felt different. Not haunted, but promising. It wasn't ours anymore. It was mine. I replaced the dining table we once used for hosting friends with something smaller, simpler. I repainted the bedroom, changed the linens, and stripped away decorations tied to her. Each change made the space feel like a reflection of me, not a remnant of us. The transformation wasn't just physical. I reconnected with old friends, reaching out to people I hadn't seen in years. Some knew about the divorce, others didn't, but none of them pried. They welcomed me back without hesitation, reminding me that I hadn't been as alone as I'd thought. I also started therapy, something I'd resisted for too long. Talking to someone neutral helped me unpack the layers of betrayal and loss. It wasn't about blaming Amelia or wallowing in what happened. It was about understanding myself, about making peace with the past so I could move forward. Months passed, and the wounds began to heal. Scars remained, as they always do, but they no longer defined me. I found myself laughing more, savoring small moments I'd once overlooked. Life didn't feel like something to endure anymore. It felt like something to embrace. One evening, while sorting through a box of old photos, I came across the honeymoon picture, the one I'd placed face down weeks ago. I studied the smiles, the warmth that had once seemed so genuine. It didn't hurt the way it used to. I placed the photo in the box and sealed it shut. It wasn't part of my story anymore. The next morning, I dropped the box at a donation center and drove away without a second thought. As the road stretched out before me, open and full of possibility, I felt lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back. The future was mine, and I was ready.